High Westhus drags off with a great wound in his back, through which the lung pulses at every breath. I can only press his hand. It's all up, Paul, he groans, and he bites his arm because of the pain. We see men living with their skulls blown open. We see soldiers run with their 2 feet cut off. They stagger on their splintered stumps into the next shell hole. A lance corporal crawls a mile and a half on his hands, dragging his smashed knee after him. Another goes to the dressing station, and over his clasped hands bulge his intestines. We see men without mouths, without jaws, without faces. We find one man who has held the artery of his arm in his teeth for 2 hours in order not to bleed to death. The sun goes down, night comes, the shells whine. Life is at an end. Among the books that were burned in these large bonfires in the 1930s by the German Student Union, these famous, infamous Nazi book burnings, is All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. And there's no wonder why this book was burned. It was a very unflinching look at the horrors and just the awful, awful experiences of World War I. And at a time, in a culture, in a society, where there's a kind of militarism and an accelerationism and a sense of national pride and a desire for expansion and a sense of the utility and the virtue of force. This, of course, is a very dangerous book because it highlights the reality of war and the intolerable, unassimilably awful nature of those experiences. So, in the year 2024, as war wages in the world around me, I find myself thinking about this book, and I just sort of bookmarked a few of the passages that have stayed with me, that I've been thinking about, and I thought I would just go through them one by one and sort of see what comes up. You know, this is a less prepared video than some of my others, so we'll see how it goes. The book follows our main character, Paul Baumer, from his little idyllic town in Germany to his schooling, to his being recruited into the army to fight in this great war, and the nationalism and the pride and the excitement and the energy around all that. And then it follows, of course, we follow him to the front and to his experiences, first through training and then on the battlefield itself. One of his experiences being on the receiving end of artillery fire. We're told the hedge is destroyed, the rails of the light rail are torn up and rise stiffly in the air in great arches. Someone lies in front of us. We stop. Kropp goes on alone with the wounded man. The man on the ground is a recruit. His hip is covered with blood. He is so exhausted that I feel for my water bottle where I have rum and tea. Cat restrains my hand and stoops over him. Where's it got you, comrade? His eyes move. He is too weak to answer. We slit open his trousers carefully. He groans. Gently, gently. It is much better. If he has been hit in the stomach, he oughtn't to drink anything. There's no vomiting. That's a good sign. We lay the hip bare. It is one mass of mincemeat and bone splinters. The joint has been hit. This lad won't walk any more. I wet his temples with a moistened finger and give him a swig. His eyes move again. We see now that the right arm is bleeding as well. Cat spreads out 2 wads of dressing as wide as possible so that they will cover the wound. I look for something to bind loosely round it. We have nothing more, so I slip up the wounded man's trouser leg still farther in order to use a piece of his underpants as a bandage. But he's wearing none. I now look at him closely. We know why he's wearing none, by the way. He's wearing none because we saw earlier in the book that the soldiers wet themselves. In the meantime, Cat has taken a bandage from a dead man's pocket and we carefully bind the wound. I say to the youngster who looks at us fixedly, "We're going for a stretcher now." Then he opens his mouth and whispers, "Stay here. We'll be back soon," says Cat. "We are only going to get a stretcher for you." We don't know if he understands. He whimpers like a child and plucks at us. "Don't go away." Cat looks around and whispers, "Shouldn't we just take a revolver and put an end to it? The youngster will hardly survive the carrying, and at the most he will only last a few days. What he has gone through so far is nothing to what he's in for till he dies. Now he is numb and feels nothing. In an hour he will become one screaming bundle of intolerable pain. Every day that he can live will be a howling torture. And to whom does it matter whether he has them or not? I nod. Yes, Cat, we ought to put him out of his misery. He stands still a moment. He has made up his mind. We look round, but we are no longer alone. A little group is gathering. From the shell holes and trenches appear heads. We get a stretcher. Cat shakes his head. End quote. Right? And that is one of these sort of taboo facts about war, about not just war, the experience of being on the receiving end of a bombardment, whether those be civilians or soldiers, that the horror and the devastation to the body and these moral questions of, do you put someone out of their misery? We don't think about those. These are so taboo. But it's just part of the horror of what war and bombardment and dropping bombs on people means in real life. That's part of what it means. And All Quiet on the Western Front says, look at this. This is what it means to drop bombs on people. That's what it means. To my next bookmark here. Another example, more examples of being on the receiving end of bombs, being on the receiving end of bombardments. So, it says, we wake up in the middle of the night. The earth booms. Heavy fire is falling on us. We crouch into corners. We distinguish shells of every caliber. Each man lays hold of his things and looks again every minute to reassure himself that they are still there. The dugout heaves. The night roars and flashes. We look at each other in momentary flashes of light, and with pale faces and pressed lips shake our heads. Every man is aware of the heavy shells tearing down the parapet, rooting up the embankment and demolishing the upper layers of concrete. When a shell lands in the trench, we note how the hollow, furious blast is like a blow from the paw of a raging beast of prey. Already by morning, a few of the recruits are green and vomiting. They are too inexperienced. Right? I mean, of course, these are soldiers. The scene goes on for a while. I'm going to skip now a bit. It describes, again, more of being on the receiving end, just the horror, the terror of being on the receiving end of bombing. Just unimaginable terror of the shock and just the fear. And there's one recruit who's like losing it, they see. So here we are. The recruits are eyeing him. We must watch them. These things are catching. Already some lips begin to quiver. The bombardment does not diminish. It is falling in the rear too. As far as one can see, spout fountains of mud and iron. Skipping. The night is unbearable. We cannot sleep, but stare ahead of us and doze. Skipping. We wait and wait. By midday, what I expected happens. One of the recruits has a fit. I have been watching him for a long time, grinding his teeth and opening and shutting his fists. These hunted, protruding eyes, we know them too well. During the last few hours, he has had merely the appearance of calm. He had collapsed like a rotten tree. Now he stands up, stealthily creeps across the floor, hesitates a moment, and then glides towards the door. I intercept him and say, "Where are you going?" Skipping. He begins to rave. "Leave me alone. Let me go out. I will go out." He won't listen to anything and hits out. His mouth is wet and pours out words, half-choked, meaningless words. If we let him go, he would run about everywhere regardless of cover. He is not the first. Though he raves and his eyes roll, it can't be helped. We have to give him a hiding to bring him to his senses. We do it quickly and mercilessly. And at last he sits down quietly. The others have turned pale. Let's hope it deters them. This bombardment is too much for the poor devils. Skipping now. The recruit starts to rave again, and two others follow suit. One jumps up and rushes out. We have trouble with the other two. I start after one who escapes and wonder whether to shoot him in the leg. Then it shrieks again. I fling myself down, and when I stand up, the wall of the trench is plastered with smoking splinters, lumps of flesh, and bits of uniform. I scramble back. The first recruit seems actually to have gone insane. He butts his head against the wall like a goat. We must try tonight to take him to the rear. Meanwhile, we bind him, but in such a way that in case of an attack, he can be released at once. End quote. I mean, this is the experience of being on the receiving end of a bombardment. And I mean, to be honest, you can see these things today in the year 2024 if you know where to look. I mean, I've seen things, and I mostly try to avoid seeing these things, but there's social media posts and pictures and videos of people under bombardment today. And it's awful. And it's as awful as it's described in this book. It's as horrific. The Wounded. I skip to my next bookmark. Describing the scene on the front. The days go by, and the incredible hours follow one another as a matter of course. Attacks alternate with counterattacks, and slowly the dead pile up in the field of craters between the trenches. We are able to bring in most of the wounded that do not lie too far off, but many have long to wait, and we listen to them dying. For one of them we search 2 days in vain. He must be lying on his belly and unable to turn over. Otherwise, it is hard to understand why we cannot find him. For it is only when a man has his mouth close to the ground that it is impossible to gauge the direction of his cry. He must have been badly hit. One of those nasty wounds, neither so severe that they exhaust the body at once, and a man dreams on in a half swoon, nor so light that a man endures the pain in the hope of becoming well again. Cat thinks he has either a broken pelvis or a shot through the spine. His chest cannot have been injured, otherwise he would not have such strength to cry out. And if it were any other kind of wound, it would be possible to see him moving. He grows gradually hoarser. The voice is so strangely pitched that it seems to be everywhere. The first night some of our fellows go out 3 times to look for him, but when they think they have located him and crawl across, the next time they hear the voice, it seems to come from somewhere else altogether. We search in vain until dawn. We scrutinize the field all day with glasses, but discover nothing. On the second day, the calls are fainter. That will be because his lips and mouth have become dry. Our company commander has promised next turn of leave with 3 days extra to anyone who finds him. This is a powerful inducement, but we would do all that is possible without that, for his cry is terrible. Cat and Crop even go out in the afternoon, and Albert gets the lobe of his ear shot off in consequence. It is to no purpose. They come back without him. It is easy to understand what he cries. At first, he called only for help. The second night, he must have had some delirium. He talked with his wife and his children. We often detected the name Elise. Today, he merely weeps. By evening, the voice dwindles to a croaking, but it persists still through the whole night. We hear it so distinctly because the wind blows toward our line. In the morning, when we suppose he must already have long gone to his rest, there comes across us one last gurgling rattle. End quote. The last scene I want to share feels to me to be the most sort of important, pressing, urgent scene in the book, a scene that I keep coming back to, I keep thinking about. At this point, Paul is home on leave for some time, and he sees his family again, he sees his friends again, and of course, his town is not changed. The people in that town are not changed, but he has changed tremendously. And he's out with his father at a bar with other people. So he says, my mother is the only one who asks no questions. Not so my father. He wants me to tell him about the front. He is curious in a way that I find stupid and distressing. I no longer have any real contact with him. End quote, right? So this gap is opened up, and it opens up between loved ones. It opens up in the family, between a sense of people who are plugged in to the horror and someone who's sort of outside of that horror, who doesn't really have a sense of the horror. Continuing, there is nothing he likes more than just hearing about it. I realize he does not know that a man cannot talk of such things. I would do it willingly, but it is too dangerous for me to put these things into words. I am afraid they might become gigantic, and I'd be no longer able to master them. What would become of us if everything that happens out there were quite clear to us? So I confine myself to telling him a few amusing things, but he wants to know whether I ever had a hand-to-hand fight. I say no, and get up and go out. But that does not mend matters. After I've been startled a couple of times in the street by the screaming of the tram cars, which resembles the shriek of a shell coming straight for me, somebody taps me on the shoulder. It is my German master, and he fastens on me with the usual question. Well, how are things out there? Terrible, terrible, eh? Yes, it is dreadful, but we must carry on. right? It's dreadful. It's dreadful. We have no choice. We must carry on. Skipping. He drags me along to a table with a lot of others. They welcome me. A headmaster shakes hands with me and says, "So you come from the front. What is the spirit like out there? Excellent, eh? Excellent." I explain to him that no one would be sorry to be back home. He responds uproariously, "I can well believe it. But first you have to give the froggies a good hiding." Right? You got to do this. This is important. This widespread culture that just thinks war is the answer. Violence will make things better. And the person who just knows this is a dead end. This will not make things better. This is the wrong approach. It's the one. There's a sense of a blinders, a kind of naivety and ignorance, which leads them to think there's only one way, and that is we got to give the froggies a good hiding. There's no choice. All they understand is violence. It's us or them. What they would say? They might say to Paul, "What's the alternative?" They might say. I'm sure they would say this to Paul. "What else are we going to do? What do you suggest?" And Paul doesn't necessarily can't answer that necessarily. There is no answer, but what there is there's a sense of a blinders on, of if you really knew what this was, you would have a little more creativity. You would have a little more of a sense of there might be other things worth considering. There might be more options than you're pretending. But this culture of militarism, this culture of fetishizing strength and war, this sense of, military bombs are the answer, is so appealing and so attractive. And there's this gap that you just sort of can't communicate against. And that's what's described here. Paul can't communicate across this gap. What can he say? There's nothing he can say. He's out. He's completely outnumbered. He's completely out-argued. He has no answer to these people. But he knows that this is a dead end, and it's horrific. Skipping a bit. They argue about what we ought to annex. The headmaster with the steel chain watch wants to have at least the whole of Belgium, the coal areas of France, and a slice of Russia. He produces reasons why we must have them, and is quite inflexible until at last the others give in to him. Then he begins to expound just whereabouts in France the breakthrough must come, and he turns to me. "Now shove ahead a bit out there with your everlasting trench warfare, smash through the Johnnies, and then there will be peace." That's the way to peace. That's how it works. When you are in a certain culture of, the only way forward is war. That's the way to peace. It's very attractive. And there's no answer to it, right? How can Paul answer that? It's very attractive. The story continues, quote, "I reply that in our opinion, a breakthrough may not be possible. The enemy may have too many reserves. Besides, the war may be rather different from what people think." He dismisses the idea loftily and informs me, "I know nothing about it. The details, yes," says he, "but this relates to the whole, and of that you are not able to judge. You see only your little sector, and so cannot have any general survey." Skipping, I break away. He stuffs a few more cigars into my pocket and sends me off with a friendly slap. "All the best. I hope we will soon hear something worthwhile from you." End quote. And so, just in conclusion, I think an anti-war book is an appeal to liberate yourself from blinders, to think outside of this narrow, there's no choice but to win the war. There's no choice but more military. There's no choice but more carnage. In the year 2024, as wars rage, I think the message of the book is as true as ever. The horrors of dropping bombs on people, soldiers, especially civilians. Translate those experiences described in the book to the experience of children being on the receiving end of bombs. And again, you can find videos of that. This is not impossible to find. I think most people don't want to see that, and that's understandable. But that happens in the year 2024. And all that rhetoric of there's no choice, it's us versus them, is so narrow. An anti-war novel like this isn't a pacifist book. That's a big misconception. Paul isn't making the case that Germany needs to lay down all its weapons. Erich Maria Remarque is not saying that no country should defend itself. That's not the argument here. The argument is, if you can look clearly and understand the implications of militarism and jingoism, you will probably find yourself a lot more creative. Policymakers, leaders, the people that put these leaders into power in the first place, if there's an awareness of what war means, the rhetoric that there's no choice, the rhetoric that it's us or them, the rhetoric that we have to break through the line and that's the only way, feels a lot less convincing.